Now, glad to have you back. Now, the National Bureau of Statistics, we said earlier, says Nigeria's annual gross domestic product grew by 3.84% in the first quarter of 2024. Let's see what the figure looks like year on year. At 2023, 3.46%. That's comparing it year on year. And today we have 3.84%. In the GDP report published yesterday, the NBS said the growth rate is higher than the 3.46% recorded in Q3 of 2024. The Bureau says the growth rate is also higher than the 3.4% recorded in the fourth quarter of 2023. According to the report, the performance of the GDP in the period reviewed was driven mainly by the services sector, which recorded a growth rate of 5.37% and contributed 57.38% to the aggregate GDP. That's it there, the performance for Q4. The GDP growth rate of 5.37%, and the services sector is doing over half of what we have for the entire period being reviewed. The report further reads that the agricultural sector grew 1.76% from the growth of 2.10% recorded in the fourth quarter of 2023, while the growth of the industry sector was 2%, a decline from 3.86% recorded in the fourth quarter of 2023. Yes, my guest is Mr. Kenneth Rikume. He's with PricewaterhouseCoopers, and he's going to be joining me to break this down this afternoon. Thank you so very much. It's good to have you join us in our studio here in Eco Atlantic. Well, first of all, I would like your views with regards to these figures that we've just gotten from the NBS. 3.84% is what we have this year compared to what we had. How would you react to this, considering the fact that we are still expecting the rebased GDP to come in anytime soon?
Yeah, thanks, Tolu, for that. I think, the trajectory and that your graph you've got on the screen shows that, things are going in the right direction. For many Nigerians, 2023 and 2024 was a very significantly challenging period, particularly because the reforms of the government was just kicking in, and we had, significant economic headwinds. But the Q4 2024 report is a good sign that the economy is on the road to recovery. So that's the first thing that we can take out from these figures. And rightly so, because, in terms of how most economists anticipate 2025 to pan out, we believe that there will be, a lot of stability from an economic perspective. And we've seen the exchange rate sort of settle. We've seen prices sort of settle because you can see the inflation figures came out, yes, giving an indication that, inflation is significantly under control. However, monetary policies have not been eased yet because we have to sustain that for a period before we begin to see the signs come through. Now, having said that, even though this is, a clear trajectory that we're on the road to recovery, 3.84% GDP growth is not good enough in terms of where we want to be as a country. But it's expected, because even if you look at the expectations for 2025, from the budget perspective, 4%, but most people believe that, we're going to be in the region of, something between 3-point-something to 4%. Yeah. However, the fertility rate of the country continues to be to grow faster than GDP. So that is going to be a real concern, because potentially the wealth that is being created would not be sufficient to trickle down to every Nigerian citizen, which means that a lot of social intervention still needs to happen, especially for the vulnerable. And I like the graph which you showed, because it gives us an indication of where this growth is coming from. The services sector, yes, accounts for most of it. But you see that particularly there's been a challenge in terms of agriculture, as well as industries, manufacturing sector. This is not expected, because the manufacturing and real sector has seen significant challenges over the past 1 to 2 years, particularly in the area of their ability to raise capital, because interest rates have been significantly high. as well as, you know, so much pressure in terms of the purchasing power of Nigerians. And it would be good to see how the graph of the middle income, you know, the middle class has panned out over the years, because a lot of manufacturers, that has been a challenge. They have to balance the ability to meet the volumes and, you know, try to raise their volumes, but then not increase price in a very challenging, you know, economic situation. So that wasn't unexpected, as well as agriculture. But agriculture, I think the insight we can get from that is that we've seen a decline from 2023 to 2024. And that's a problem. That's a real problem, because a lot of the inflation that we've seen, apart from energy, we've seen inflation from food. Yeah. And we've also always been saying that, you know, one of the ways to deal with that food inflation is to improve productivity or production. But the rate at which GDP is growing in that sector gives an indication that we're still struggling in that space. And I think if I'm sitting in government and looking at policies, I'll be looking at that area as an area of significant intervention as well. But the, you know, great performers, services, when you unpack that, banking and financial services,
financial, the insurance sector
are doing very well.
Let me just come in there. Some say that some of the banking, particularly the lenders, they've been able to get much of profit from the interest rate, the large interest rate market, and they're able to pay more salaries, and inflation is on the high side. That's why we are seeing this beautiful performance from that space. You can take it away.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, interesting, because you see all sorts on social media. I saw an analysis showing different employers and the entry-level salaries, and of course, banking was there, but of course, oil and gas was really significant. But you're very correct that one of the big challenges the banking industry had faced was, you know, on the one hand, interest rates had been increased. Which is a good thing, because it means that they will earn more income from the capital which they lend out or invest. Yeah, of course. However, on the other side, there's the risk, because you know, when you have significant interest rate hikes, the ability of people to service their debt significantly reduces. So you would see that there will be pressure on the manufacturers, you know, the people in the agri space and so on, their ability to meet those obligations. But it seems, like you rightly said, that the banks have been able to ride the storm and do their credit analysis properly to ensure that, you know, bad debts and bad loans have been significantly managed. But that's not, you know, if I were to analyze this, I would think that the big area has been, for the banking and financial services industry, the reinvention of that industry. So if you look, you know, across 2020 to 2023, even 2024, what we have seen is more improved banking penetration. And it's not just the traditional banks, they've tried to reinvent themselves, but we've seen new banks and new players in the fintech space, payments, you know, and all that. That has ensured that there has been significant improvement in banking penetration and financial services generally, because in that space, the fintechs, you know, the sort of play they do is to have that microfinance platform as well as the payment solution, and they've been able to create value, which previously was, you know, many people were unable to crack. So I think that contributes significantly. And of course, Q4, we all know that there was significant activity in the economy. 30 December. 30 December was one to never to forget, and to remember. And people are waiting for 2025.
Yeah, I tell you.
So significant economic spur from that perspective. And then would I call them the small cousins, which is the insurance industry. Yeah. You know, the big challenge in that industry has been insurance penetration. It's very low. You know, when you compare with the likes of Kenya and South Africa, which, you know, you'd want to compare yourselves as one of the big giants in sub-Saharan Africa, our insurance penetration has not really improved. but there have been some government policies in that space, particularly the enforcement of the third-party insurance would have driven some growth in that space as well. But we know that there are cultural issues that only regulations can unlock, and the industry is looking at a revised Insurance Act and some regulations that would make certain sort of insurance mandatory. And when we do that, we'll be able to unlock value from that space. It's showing potential based on what we're seeing here, but there is more that can come. In other economies, you see insurance companies owning banks because they're able to mobilize capital, especially the life insurers. If you're able to mobilize premiums for life insurance, they are long-term, and you're able to improve, health provision and life expectancy. That then sits as, capital that you can use for a lot of things. So I think if we can unlock that space, it will be very significant. But I mean, just back to agriculture, I think the government is doing quite a bit in that area, so they anticipate that. So some new equipment coming in and interventions. But I think it's a critical area we need to look at if we're going to manage inflation in the long term.
Let me go to the next chart here. Agriculture, you talked about that. There's a bit of dip, from what we had the other time. Well, you've already spoken around that and what that stands in for at the moment. Yeah, but let's go to see the overall economy is valued at about 22.61 trillion naira. Nominal terms is 78.37 trillion naira. And let's look at the 10 contributing activities to real GDP in Q4 of 2024. Interestingly, trade, corporate production, crop production, I beg your pardon, real estate, telecommunications, info services, 5.88%. Looking at what financial institutions, other services, professional and scientific, construction, food and beverage, crude oil. What do you make of this very chart, looking at the 10 contributed activities to the real GDP in Q4?
Yeah, we've already spoken about financial institutions.
Yeah, we have.
But telcos, I think one of the things that would really drive that
the tariff issue
is the tariffs. The tariffs, obviously, it is not market. It's not being market driven. There's regulation pushbacks. Trying to regulate the pricing. But if you were really to unpack that, their tariffs were due for review, quite a long time. I know they have to then think of how they manage that transition, ensuring that, the low income are still serviced and they're provided products that are able to meet their needs, but then able to provide, those products that are suited for people like yourselves, Tolu, that are able to afford it. So for them, that would be a significant issue. But real estate, I've been speaking to people in the real estate space, beginning of this year, which is 2025, and you may see a shift in that figure in 2025. There's been significant movement in that space, both in terms of construction of real property and so on, as well as, mobilization of funds for new homes and all that. But the one that worries me is the crude petroleum, because that has significant potential for us to be able to meet the liquidity in the FX market.
Very important.
But when you look at, oil versus non-oil, we have this has been a challenge. But hopefully some of the interventions we're seeing would unlock that. We've seen significant acquisitions in 2024 by indigenous companies from the IOCs. The NUPRA has also given these new entrants targets in terms of production, that they've got to ramp up production, because the only way we can really mobilize that liquidity to meet our FX requirements is through hydrocarbons in the short term.
Yeah, of course.
So if we're able to raise our production, get to 2 million barrels per day.
Government is saying 2.06. The minister said it's possible.
Yes. Yes, it is possible.
I think it is.
Because, you know, when you look at what we're already doing, I think we're close
at the moment.
Yes, we're almost there.
We're almost there.
Just bringing on some additional barrels by new commitments, I think we can unlock this. There's obviously the big investment, you know, the Shell is going to come up with Bonga. That is deep offshore. May not kick in materially until 2029, where production will be ramped up, but the investment will start coming in, because in that space it's not just the production of crude, it's the investment we need to attract so that the other support services, the services, the drilling services, the other support, they're able to also create value in that space. So I think there are things the government is doing, but if they can continue to focus more and push more, we'll be able to, I think overall, if you ask me, I feel, quite optimistic based on what I see in terms of the Q4 numbers. It shows you that some of the instinct or feeling, perception that we're getting, seems to be coming through, and in 2025 could be interesting.
Positives from the policy reforms, those bold economic reforms that everyone's been talking about. It seems like we're getting a headway one way or the other. But now that we expect the rebased GDP from the NBS, and considering all of the sectors that will be put together, the creative sector, all of those sectors that were not in before now in the basket, to be put together, what are you projecting? Some say we should be looking at about 4%. Some say we should be looking at over 4%. President Tinubu is looking at 6%. That's it at the end of the day. But gradually, let's just be modest. What do you think we should be looking at? To
be honest, Tolu, I hate doing predictions because obviously I've got no crystal ball to look at it. I think people need to not be carried away by the GDP number and say, okay, the GDP growth is 6%, 7%. I think, the base effect would kick in because, if you're using the rebased, figures, it means that you're comparing like with like. So the growth would be with like, right? So I want people to tone down their expectations a bit and, not get carried away that you'll get to 10% or all that. So that's one thing. But the real issue is actually for the common man on the street, the inclusive growth. And for me, it's not about the figures. It's about how we're able to do some social intervention in that space to ensure that we are carrying everybody along. I think education will be key. When I spoke about the growth in our population and the fertility rate, one of the things we need to see in some of the states is more investment in education. I know, with the FAC allocation, there's increased revenue that is going to the states. The local governments have, through a Supreme Court judgment, they now have the, autonomy to control their own funds. But we need fiscal discipline and prudence to ensure that those revenues are invested in areas that can give real return to society at large. And if we do that, I think that that's where the real game changer can come through. One of the things that we see, I call it a paradox, is that with more education of a population, the growth in the population sort of reduces significantly, right? Because people are then able to do other vocations other than farming. So what tends to happen is that people want, in order to work the farm, people believe that they've got to have more kids and children in the rural areas to be able to work the farms. But with education, there are other vocations that people can explore, especially in the services space, that can create value. And when you begin to see that, as we've seen in the West, because it could become a problem in the future, that you then have more aged population than young population, because people are not having more babies. There are even countries today that would, have programs to attract people from other countries, including Africa, because their population is in decline. But with education, I think we can then manage that and begin to see a GDP growth that is more aligned with population growth. And that, for me, I think would be a real game changer. So overall, I think positives from what we've seen from the statistics coming from the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics.
Okay, we have 2 minutes to go. Looking at the rebased inflation figures.
Yeah.
You know, I wanted your views even around that earlier. And you've seen what that has done to the Monetary Policy Committee. They had to retain the rates, and everyone says that's the wisest thing to have been done by the Apex Bank. Do you also think along that line? Yeah,
so we had an interesting thing, where I work, where somebody put up a poll in terms of expectations, whether interest rates, the MPC will cut rates, or whether they would leave it, or whether they will increase it. In my mind, it was very clear, even though I couldn't answer, that they were going to leave it where it is, because you do not want a rollback of some of the progress they've made in terms of curbing inflation. So just keeping it there and ensuring that there is stabilization of prices in the first instance, I think makes sense. But there's also an FX issue here as well, because what tends to happen is when there's a lot of money in supply, there's been that urge from people to go and, invest, so-called, in foreign currency. So I never thought they were going to ease it because, in terms of what they're doing, you do not want things to roll back quickly. I think when you look at the monetary policies versus the interventions in the FX space, you see that the CBN has taken the steps in the right direction. Exchange rate is under control with the electronic foreign exchange market system that brings more transparency, and as well as managing the interest rates. FX rate is coming down. Inflation rate is coming down. GDP growth is coming through. But then we need to stimulate some strategic sectors to make things work.
Let's touch on those sectors.
Obviously, for me,
manufacturing.
Yeah, manufacturing. Are we ever going to be an industrialized country?
EFCFTA is there.
Is a key question. If we do not do it, then we are going to be uncompetitive when, with the kicking of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. So we must look at industrialization. We must also look at our free zones and ensure that our free zones are more productive. The free zones for me is an interesting concept, and in many cases, many countries have used that to ensure that they are more industrialized by granting incentives to those businesses. And I think, Tolu, we've had several conversations on this, the outsourcing industry, because, Nigeria, with the devaluation, salaries are more competitive in the global space, so we're now cheaper. We have an educated workforce. We have challenges with unemployment. We have to be more strategic around, look at what India did, go and study it, and come and model it from a Nigerian perspective. And English is our day-to-day language. There's no way we shouldn't plug into that international value chain and contribute, whether it is paralegal, whether it is full legal. With AI, knowledge is now democratized. So we can really mobilize this, our mass population, and create significant value. If we do not do it, other countries will do it.
Partner, tax and reporting and strategy, PricewaterhouseCoopers. I've been speaking to Mr. Kenneth Erikume. Thank you so much, a friend of the house. It's good to have you in to break these figures down for us.
Thanks for inviting me to your nice studio.
Thank you so much for your